Hi, my name is Megan Robbins, and I'm going to be doing a quick lecture on Mentalist Linguistics today, with a focus on Noam Chomsky. First of all, I just want to start by saying Noam Chomsky has made revolutionary contributions over the past 50, 60, 70 years to the field of linguistics, also to philosophy. He's a person that I studied previously in a different context, and so I was really excited that he came into the picture because he's just a superhero of mine and someone who's always been able to comment so thoughtfully on what's going on in society, and really a intellectual activist for justice, ethical issues, and many more. So just to give some broader context of who this guy is, if you need any more, his website I'll show at the end. If you want any more background knowledge about him or want to read what he writes, I'll share that with you later. So today we're going to just start by looking at this quote. It's actually not by Noam Chomsky, but someone who is writing about him. It's Norbert Hornstein on Noam Chomsky. And the first way that he describes Noam's philosophy is by saying, fish swim, birds fly, people talk. So this is right off the bat, just with that simple quote, it really sets the stage that language is a biological endowment to humans, just as the instinct to fly, the ability to fly, and the capacity to fly is unique to the bird. The bird has specific wingspan that are the right measurements that allow him to fly. Same with fish breathing underwater. They have particular organs that allow them to do that. So do humans talk. And we have a particular biologically endowed set of language faculties that allow us to do that. And that's the basis of mentalist linguistics. So, let's start talking. Our introduction. Mentalist linguistics is like I already said, it's based on the idea that language is not a learned behavior. And I think first, when we talk about mentalist linguistics, it's important to look at, even though I don't really in this lecture want to go too far into behaviorist language or linguistics, you kind of have to understand what mentalism is not. So, on this next little slide, why is language not learned? And it says here, I know everything might be backwards to you, but it says here that Bloomfield, so Leonard Bloomfield is one of the fathers of behavioralist linguistics, and says that language is a conditioned response based on training. So there at the bottom you see stimulus, response, reinforcement, repeat. This reminded me a lot of how I trained my puppy, who is now 8 months old. So there's a continuous stimulus to what we want her to do. Do we want her to sit? Do we want her to lay down? Do we want her to go outside? Do we want her to be able to communicate when she needs to go outside? And the way that we do this is treats, positive reinforcement. Try not to give much a negative, but sometimes that happens when she pees on the carpet. So, this is what I had in my head. This is the image that I had in my head. So in this case, we see that children are taught language, that it is part of the structure of the community, that we would teach them intentionally, that it's learned by mimicking, it's learned by analogy, it's specifically a learned behavior. Chomsky has a lot of issues with this and completely disagrees, in fact. So he says, as we've already stated, that language is a biologically predetermined by genetics, and the faculties disposed to language are revealed. So as we experience the world, the experience triggers our innate faculties and kind of an innate knowledge. Whenever our faculties identify something that's already there, innate, it makes this cognitive connection and therefore retains the language, and it keeps building like that. It grows much like a limb would grow, like your arm, where you start little and then you end big, right? So it's the same thing. In the video that you had us watch, Noam talks about the analogy of puberty, and actually it's the guy interviewing him that discusses that, and he says it's a really great analogy for what he's trying to say. It's going to happen regardless. Nobody's going to teach you how to go through puberty. They might inform you that it's going to happen and what the observable outcomes will be, but nobody says, okay, you have to go through puberty now and this is how you do it. It's something that just happens biologically. Secondly, here I have a little growth versus learning. That's really, really important for Chomsky. So he says we need to understand that there's a distinction between growth versus learning. It would be misleading to say that language is learned. So if we see here, growth is analogous to something like an event such as birth, puberty, or death. It's innate, it's inborn, it just happens for the human being. He also says that language faculties are much like other organs in the body. Versus learning, which is, it insinuates that it's imposed upon the learner, like a tool. I have the word disregards, and the reason that I have the word disregards is because I want to expand on that. It disregards any idea that there would be any biological connection to language acquisition. It's totally imposed upon the learner. Language is a tool, a possession. Like if I taught you how to use a hammer, this would be a similar analogy to how we could think about learning how to do something, a skill with a tool. Whereas Chomsky's saying, no, we do not possess language. Actually, it's more like language possesses us and creates kind of our world intelligibly so that we can interact with it. For that to happen, there has to be something innate, that we're automatically interacting with the world as it comes at us. Now that begins to sound a bit Kantian, which interestingly enough is, and we can see some of his influences that we're going to talk about later in terms of philosophy. So let me move on to the next little slide, which is the nature of language according to the mentalist approach. So you can see there's a lot of things there. I'm just going to give you a second to look. It might be backwards. I didn't think about it being backwards, but we'll go ahead and just go through them here. So language, according to the mentalist theory, is that it's rule-governed, it's complex, it's a biological endowment, it's an organ which grows your language faculties, it's pre-programmed, it's a rigid structure, it's cognitive and experience-based, meaning that it's a cognitive process and experience triggers the development of this process. It is not stimulus-bound. It's minimalistic, meaning that there are lots of different languages that we speak on Earth. However, these actually only have minor differences. It has limitless possibilities, which we're also going to investigate. What does that mean? It is rule governed, so we're back to the top. Now, I don't have time to go through all of these individually. It would be a really, really long lecture, and we're already getting a little lengthy. So I'm just going to choose a few that I thought were the most interesting, provocative, and stick specifically to the mentalist, Chomsky's mentalism, and what he's faced because of his ideas and theories. So why is mentalist, when you read, when you go online, when you begin to watch videos, the mentalist approach to linguistics tends to be incredibly provocative. So I want to address that. Why is it provocative? And there's two reasons here, and I'm just going to describe each one. The first one that I had listed was, this is really postmodern thinking in what's still a modern world in the 1950s. Chomsky's really rejecting the notion of imperialism in terms of like thinkers such as Hume and Freud, the way that they're going to present their understanding of knowledge. He's kind of rejecting that. He's moving past that. So he's saying children cannot describe the faculties of language. That's an assumption that he believes Hume is making. And he says children can't do that. Specifically in the video, he's like, any more than we could describe what our liver is doing at any given moment. We are not aware of what is going on internally. But he says there's plenty observable evidence, which we're going to move to on the next slide. But this is radical, because the reality is that modern thinking is marked by people like Hume, right? Where we can kind of have a certain certainty about and control, and humans have kind of reached the height of like what we can accomplish. We've developed the clock, we have skyscrapers, we feel like the kings of our world, and in a sense able to control everything. And that's in a sense kind of what empirical research is all about, not only our ability to observe, but our ability to control. And the sense that we can do anything that we set our minds to. Now, what Chomsky's thinking, and even what the interviewer kind of gets uncomfortable with when you're watching the videos, is modernists really don't like limits. They don't like the imposition of limits. The idea that there is something, knowledge or a philosophical question that's just kind of beyond what our language faculties or what our brain, beyond where we could go, beyond the horizon, right? And so they really struggle with the idea of language being based on a rigid internal structure, because rigid internal structure really kind of indicates that there are limits to what we can do with it. And this is the big word that I think is the biggest problem, and probably the most provocative, is this relationship between a rigid structure and human freedom. And this is really where we see Chomsky taking a huge departure from modern thinkers like Hume and Freud. He mentions kind of leaning into a more British Neoplatonic school of thought, Cartesian, and especially Kantian, which he says that Kantian is kind of Kantian thinking is like an embodiment of more of this British Neoplatonic Cartesian thinking, which he's probably right. So what we want to examine, really quickly before we end the lecture is, what is this? Why is there this tension between, modern thinking and what we now can identify as like more postmodern thinking? And I think it does have to do with what we think we're capable of as human beings, our philosophical inquiry, especially our scientific inquiry, and identifying what Chomsky is trying to identify, that, listen, having limits to inquiry is okay. There's actually questions we've been asking for centuries that we still don't have any answers to, like a person's will, a decision making, why they make decisions. And he's saying there's certain things that are just beyond our capacity of thought. And he's saying that just because this language faculty organ isn't necessarily observable, that doesn't mean that it's not valid. He says, in fact, that every utterance is an experiment. This was one of my favorite quotes from the interview. So we don't see the language faculties yet, like we could observe a liver, but we see the results. Observing mature language just means observing language, listening to an utterance. So you're listening to the result. My sister is a speech pathologist, and I was kind of talking to her about this and, getting ready to present, this information. And she's like, I totally kind of understand where Chomsky's coming from, because she's like, my job isn't to prescribe how children should speak. It's to observe. It's to observe children at certain points where in their acquisition of language journey, and because of over time we've been able to observe utterances, we know that children should reach a certain mark and then reach a certain mark by the next age as they move down the road. So this is how we can measure that cognitive function and whether it's working. And she said, whenever I look at a child and observe a child, what I'm really looking for is, have they reached those benchmarks? And is there a serious reason, maybe a physical reason, why they might be delayed? And she said, so my job is based on science in that all I'm doing is observing the utterance, which I think really falls in line with this mentalist approach to what Chomsky has been saying since the 1950s. I think the next phase that we have to talk about as we begin to kind of wrap up our lecture today is the implications. What are the implications of mentalist linguistics? And I have written down here, this is a really fun field for me, and so we could really go off talking about this for ages and ages, but this Kantian paradox of freedom and finitude. So whenever I think about what Chomsky's kind of approaching here, that it's actually better for us that our language faculties are a rigid system. Because if they weren't, we would be totally dependent on the environment, and in a sense, much more limited. But because we have this very rich, rigid system, our ability to kind of process the infinite number of things that are coming at us every day is limitless. The possibilities are limitless, very much because we have this rich, rigid system. I think of whenever I was listening him talk about this system and explaining the implications of this approach, I thought a lot of the creation of Adam, where you have God reaching down to man and man reaching up to God, and how we have this, in a sense, limited faculties, right, based on biological genetic predisposition. However, we're able to interact with the world, make decisions, have desires, based on what? And I think it really does come from this internal mechanism, this rich, rigid system that not only is relating to what's coming at us, processing it and matching it up so we're able to make sense of the world, but is entirely productive and creative. And this system means that we're not subject to just reflecting on the stimuli of our environment. We are unbounded in what we can do and what we can produce in terms of our inquiry, our investigation, even having this discussion right now. We are able to imagine things that we've never seen. We're able to speak about things that we've never seen before. We're able to imagine that there's this language faculty, and we are capable of producing utterances of what that might look like because of the nature of our language, just by observing our utterances. So, in a sense, the implications of mentalist linguistics are not that we have limits, which I think is the modernist fear and the fear of the behaviorists, but that we have a kind of freedom, paradoxically, because of this rigid system. And I think that Chomsky himself sees this as a kind of potential, that there's really no problem, social or otherwise, that we can't deliberate with, that we can't work through, if we're really paying attention to the limits of language and the limits of us as human beings. And so I loved reading his more recent articles on what's going on with the election in the United States and the issues that are coming up. And you really see the connection between the way that he understands the world and his mentalist linguistics, and the way those two things really come together holistically when he begins to approach injustice or ethical issues in the world. To end today, I have a few references that I just wanted you to be able to see there. Sorry. So I've got one of Chomsky's books, of course, the systematic structures, which presents the major presenter. I'm sorry that this is backwards if you're seeing it backwards. I've got his contribution to words and objections, and I've got a slide share that I found through the RIO website. Not to mention our own text for the class, and the videos that you gave us were extremely and extraordinarily helpful. So in all, I think, all in all, we see that mentalist linguistics is looking at it with this biological, endowed, rigid structure. We see that the potential for the human mind for language is absolutely limitless, free, and creative. And we are able to tackle even the most difficult of human experiences. We are able to make advances in the world because of the nature of our language and our knowledge and the way we acquire this language. So I hope all in all that we've been able to tackle mentalism and mentalistic linguistics according to Noam Chomsky. I'm so excited to get to talk about this amazing thinker who truly is a visionary and way ahead of his time. I would say he really paved the road for more postmodern thinking in many ways, and I have learned so much from this project, and I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you so much. Again, my name is Megan Robbins, and you've been listening to Mentalist Linguistics, a commentary. Thank you. Bye-bye.